there's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, Stephen Feach is still with us in Washington. Stephen, President Bush vowing to fight
what we call a crawl moving across, that is a list of all the companies and businesses that were in the World Trade Center. You will see that this goes on and on and on, and you will see why this rapidly adds up to some 50,000 people working at the Twin Towers.
And also why bin Laden would select the Twin Towers to do his work, because he knows that no other place in America could he do more injury, more damage to the American way of life and the economy and the people than the two trade towers, and the Pentagon, of course, the military center of activity. He very brilliant, very well funded. We have some friends like Saudi Arabia who may be putting some money into his ventures. And I think the time has come to stop apologizing and tiptoeing through the tulips. Find out where the guy is, blow him away, all of his people with him, be done with that, and let the terrorist world know that you may pick on America, but you'll be sorry you did.
Okay.
Until we do that, we're in trouble.
All right, and I don't think you're going to find very many Americans to argue with that about bin Laden. But what about Afghanistan itself? What about the government that harbors him and says that it's not, that says that he doesn't have the power to do these sorts of things, but he does, that says that he is just a poor, impoverished Saudi exile living in their country as a guest, but perhaps he's more. What about Afghanistan?
Well, I think Afghanistan is a co-conspirator, and I think that they, at the same time, they're nervous about him. They wouldn't dare go against him because he has the heart and the support of most of the radical fundamentalist Muslims worldwide, including Arafat, etc. These people are all butchers. They're barbarians, and frankly, I think that we should give Afghanistan an opportunity to turn bin Laden over to us, but I wouldn't give him any more than 24 hours to do it.
You know, Reverend Falwell, today, among the many quotes from many public officials about this, Senator Robert Torricelli of New Jersey said, something must be done, and mere apprehension of those responsible is insufficient. He seems to be saying the mere fact that we could go out and arrest Osama bin Laden, or Afghanistan might turn over Osama bin Laden, is not going to be enough, that there is an extra poundage of flesh we want. So from who?
Well, I don't know about the pound of flesh. I know that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and
but that was a country. Bin Laden isn't a country.
I know he's not, but he's just as dangerous, because Hitler was never able to bring anything down to New York or Washington, and this guy is being allowed, with oil money and with Arab nations funding, and with with those who hate America because we support Israel. They're going to drive Israel into the Mediterranean if we don't do something, and we can't let that happen. We are the friend of Israel, and I believe that God blesses us because we are, and now they hate us because we love Israel, and I think we've just messed around and fooled around. As a Campbell County, Virginia boy, I would say it that way, long enough, and the time has come just to ask Afghanistan to cooperate and deliver him to us, and if not, take them both out at the same time.
Reverend Jerry Falwell. Reverend Falwell, thanks very much for your views tonight. We will certainly be talking to you later. Linda.
Thank you.
We have with us now Greg Fife. He is a former senior safety investigator for the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. Greg, explain to us now what role the NTSB takes in the investigation of the downing of the 4 aircraft.
Well, given the fact that there are 4 separate areas that the teams would have to go to, the biggest concern now is recovering both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder in hopes of getting some vital information that'll help all the other authorities that are going to be conducting this investigation.
Okay, we understand a couple of things. We've gotten a couple of facts that we're working with now.
Okay.
Number one, that on all 4 hijacked planes, the transponders were turned off. Explain what the transponders are and what this indicates to you.
Basically, the transponder is just a piece of radio equipment on the airplane that the air traffic controllers will give the pilot what they call a discrete squawk code. They'll give them a specific number, 1, 2, 3, 4. The pilots will enter that into their transponder, and then they can track that specific airplane, that specific flight, by that unique identification code. So when they turn it off, they don't get the detailed information on the ground in the radar center that they would typically get. So they don't have airspeeds, they don't have altitudes or the flight number. All they have is a primary return, which just basically shows a dot on a screen moving in a direction.
Greg, one of the most important things, as you mentioned, is finding the cockpit voice recorder. It may be difficult in the World Trade Center with the 2 aircraft that crashed into those towers. But perhaps you have the one in Pittsburgh that you can get your hands on, and perhaps you have the one at the Pentagon that you can get your hands on. Of course, you might get the conversations in the cockpit. That would be key, right?
That would be very key for the investigative process. But if they were smart enough to turn off the transponder, they may have also been smart enough to pull the circuit breakers that run the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. So you could find those boxes with hopes of having some good information, only to have those hopes dashed very easily because they pulled the circuit breakers which powers those boxes. So you may not have any information at all. The other point to be made is that because of the intensities of the fires, both at the Trade Center and at the Pentagon, the fact is that those boxes may not have survived the intense heat, because the boxes are typically designed to withstand about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit for a period of about 30 minutes. So again, depending on where they were found, if they are found, and what kind of fire exposure they have, they may or may not yield the information that would help investigators.
It's beginning to appear that each of the planes did fly for some time after the hijackers had taken over. Does this lead you to believe that the hijackers had to have some, at least passing, if not intimate, knowledge of how to fly a plane?
Given the sophistication of these types of airplanes, the 757 and the 767, which share a common cockpit, the training that would be involved, you could basically train someone to fly the airplane basically straight and level and follow headings relatively easy in a very short period of time. But given the preciseness of how these airplanes struck both the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, there may have been some additional education on the part of the hijackers that they could have actually flown the airplane on autopilot by programming the flight management system that would, get them basically in the general area of which they wanted to be, both here in Washington and in New York, and then clicked off the autopilot and hand-flown the airplanes then into the target.
Assuming you can find the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder in the rubble in the 4 different sites, the chances that those boxes are intact are, what would you say?
Basically slim to none. Only because in looking at the damage, and being in Washington, I came in for a safety meeting. I was going to give a speech on aviation safety to the Coalition of Airline Pilots Association. And in looking at the damage to the Pentagon across the river this morning, and then of course at the World Trade Center, the fact that the collapse of the Trade Center, I would suspect that it will be very difficult to find any of those cockpit voice recorders or flight data recorders intact if the modules which are encapsulated inside the container or the orange painted part of the box, if they have survived, which is the most stout part, then there's a high probability that the information on those boxes may be good. But I wouldn't hang a lot of hope on that.
And now I realize that you were very different from the FAA, and it's the aviation security system around the country that's the FAA's business. However, I'd like to get your comment. The General Accounting Office warned in April of 2000 that, quote, serious vulnerabilities in the aviation security system exist and must be adequately addressed. Among the things that they said were a problem was training for airport security regarding screening and bomb detection. What, in your work with the NTSB, has been your experience with what kind of gaps there are in aviation security?
Well, one of the things with the NTSB, we never really looked at a security issue because in this particular instance, this is no longer an accident. And the NTSB's responsibility, of course, is to determine the facts, conditions, and circumstances in any type of accident, whether it be aviation or other modes of transportation, to promote safety. So in the security aspect, the NTSB really never got involved. However, when you look at the type of accident that these are, which basically have no longer technically are classified as an accident, they are an intentional act, that shifts the burden now to the appropriate authorities such as the FBI to look at the investigation process for determining where the shortcomings were that led to these particular events. And so the NTSB's role would be to assist them in putting back the airplanes in parts and pieces so that they may identify some of the evidence that may have still remained in the wreckage. But from the security standpoint, as a safety consultant and a guy who flies on an airplane just about every day, security starts.
A terrorist attack on America in its long history, the most serious attack since Pearl Harbor. President Bush is back at the White House tonight. He has pledged to the American people that those responsible will be brought to justice, and any nation that harbored them will suffer the consequences as well. In Lower Manhattan, frantic rescue efforts continue underway. The collapse of two 110-story towers and another 40-story building, tons of rubble and steel and debris and smoke. But now New York City police officials are telling us that some people trapped in the rubble are on their cell phones saying they're still alive. Let's go to NBC's Rahema Ellis now and get the latest from her. She's had a tour of Ground Zero. Rahema?
Tom, I'm about 15 blocks right now from the World Trade Center, but with two outstanding producers and an incredible cameraman, the four of us made our way past the police barricades and right into the heart of the disaster. Take a look at some of these pictures. The firefighters are still hosing down the smoldering remains of what is left of the World Trade Center area, and the emergency searchlights cast an eerie glow over this area. It is absolutely frightening and devastating. There is no one in this area except emergency workers. They are literally raking through the rubble, hoping that they will find someone alive, and in a miracle of miracles, within the hour, I was told, they did pull one man, a Port Authority worker, from the rubble alive. 30 minutes prior to that, a fire department official told me they pulled another man from the rubble. We understand he is also a Port Authority worker, that he was pulled alive from the rubble and taken to a nearby hospital. It is almost unbelievable to think that anybody could survive what has happened down in that area, Tom. It is just covered with dust and soot. It is difficult to see. It is very hard to breathe. Nonetheless, the firefighters are going inside, but there are still fires that are breaking out throughout the area. As one firefighter told me, they're going in teams, but because it is such an unbearable heat, they can stay in for only a short time, and then they have to come out. But in the staging area, the deputy fire chief said they will continue to send in waves of firefighters all night long. They are not giving up hope that they might find more people alive. Tom?
NBC's Rahema Ellis, those are extraordinary pictures that you're sharing with us now. This is from earlier today, the collapse of those twin towers of the World Trade Center. There have been rough estimates that there may have been as many as 20,000 people inside at the time. Many of them were able to escape through the stairwells when the planes first hit the building number one and then building number two, but then thousands more were trapped inside and they have not been heard from. There were not as many patients at the New York City hospitals as people had anticipated because simply there were not that many that they were able to get out of there. Then when the buildings came down, emergency rescue personnel, firemen and policemen were in the area. The New York City Firemen's Union reports that at least 200 firemen were killed at that time, although city and state officials, including the mayor and Governor George Pataki, say that that number cannot be confirmed. People are saying quietly that they do expect the death toll could be in the thousands. That's the scene in New York City. We want to get you an update now on what is going on in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, the emblematic building of the United States military, a fortress that it was attacked today by a hijacked airliner. And tonight we got the stunning news that the military is saying that 800 people at least were killed in that attack. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski is there now. Jim?
That's right, Tom, and there's little hope of actually finding, unlike at the World Trade Center, of finding any survivors here. One of the reasons is you look back at the devastation and you can see where the 757 American Airlines that was hijacked by the group of terrorists who were at the controls, when they slammed the plane into the side of the building, the plane sliced deeply into the building. What you're looking at here is called the E-ring. There are 5 rings to this building, and the plane continued on through the E-ring, through the D-ring, into the C-ring, where the damage occurred. But one of the problems is, even as the upper floors collapsed down on the wreckage, there was an intense fire that burned for hours. So the hopes of finding any survivors is very dim tonight. Firefighters seem to have finally gotten the fires under control. They continued to flicker and actually burst through the roof throughout the evening. They bring back in the trucks and hose it down, only to find a fire pop up somewhere else in that section of the building. But for about the past hour and a half or so, we haven't seen any more flames. But according to local fire officials, the rescue workers are now in the scene there. We did see some heavy earth-moving equipment moving some of the rubble, a clear sign that they don't expect any survivors underneath. And those rescue workers with cadaver dogs are going through the rubble in search of what now local fire officials say may be as many as 800 dead. Tom?
NBC Jim Miklaszewski. They're operating really on 2 tracks at the Pentagon, aren't they, Jim? They're trying these rescue efforts in the portion of the building that was attacked by the airliner, but at the same time, America has its military forces around the world on highest alert, so the military operations have to continue out of that same building.
And they're continuing apace, Tom, and it was almost in defiance of this attack today that Secretary Rumsfeld and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Hugh Shelton held a news conference in the Pentagon at the opposite end of the building, but nevertheless
here in New York City.
1 second after the sound started, there was gray smoke and what looked to be like confetti flying all over the place.
Fire and death above, confusion below, as some 10,000 people streamed out of the building.
There was a lady had a big gash on her head, so it was people stampeding one over top of another.
Witnesses reported a horrifying scene. Desperate people jumping from the burning skyscraper. Bloody clothing and body parts scattered on the streets below. As emergency crews rushed to the southern tip of Manhattan, the immediate thought, could it really be happening again?
Step back, okay? I'm on the job, guys.
In 1993, the same building was hit by a truck bomb, Islamic militants hoping to topple the one tower into the other. 6 people died in that attack, and 1,500 were injured. But within the first minutes today, it was clear that the toll this time would be much higher. Then, at 9:03, less than 20 minutes after the first strike, with police and rescue personnel still scrambling to respond, this.
There were many people in the building.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on this shot.
Live cameras trained on the first stricken tower captured another huge explosion, this one on the South Tower. Only this time, the attack was documented. This indelible image to be replayed again and again, seared into the American memory.
And here it comes right there.
An American Airlines 767 with 92 people on board hijacked on its flight from Boston to Los Angeles, becoming the implement of mass murder. The impact was devastating, the airliner punching through the skin of the huge tower, another rain of glass, concrete, and terror.
It's like this unbelievable ball of fire. And the whole street, which is now awakened, everyone's like, whoa. People start crying, people start running.
It was now clear that this was no accident. The first tower had also been hit by a hijacked passenger jet, a United flight that had also taken off from Boston, bound for LA. The attacks left New York virtually paralyzed. Tunnels and bridges linking the city shut down, subways closed, telephone lines jammed, cell phones overloaded as frantic callers tried to contact loved ones. At 9:30, President Bush, in Florida to talk about education, addressed a nation reeling and in need of reassurance.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
But even as the president pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible, another attack, this one even more audacious. The target, the Pentagon. Another American Airlines jet bound for Los Angeles had been hijacked, this one taking off from Washington's Dulles Airport. It was another direct hit. NBC's Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski suddenly found himself on the front lines of a war that had come home.
I don't want to alarm anybody right now, but apparently it felt just a few moments ago like there was an explosion of some kind here at the Pentagon.
9:43 a.m. With concern that the White House could be a target, President Bush boarded Air Force One bound for a special secure command post at a military base. At 9:49, the Federal Aviation Administration announced it was shutting down the nation's air traffic. In a world turned upside down, hundreds of passenger planes crisscrossing the country were now potential terrorist weapons.
The Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport.
This morning, on a scale beyond belief, Americans experienced what it's like to feel truly vulnerable, to realize when someone is willing to die for a cause, we are all potential targets. The number one suspect, this man, Osama bin Laden, a radical Islamic terrorist linked to past attacks on American interests. A London-based Arab journalist said today that 3 weeks ago, followers of bin Laden warned of a huge and unprecedented attack on the U.S. Was this it?
Somebody provided the logistical support for this operation, and clearly the only person, or one of the only people, that has built up such a network in the world today is Osama bin Laden.
There was no